The battles themselves are conducted on separate arenas, styled to look like whichever location the battle is taking place in. Most battles are entered by simply running into an enemy while exploring, though of course boss fights are most commonly entered after cutscenes. The battles flow in typical turn-based style, with Mario and two teammates taking on the assortment of enemies of any given bout. Even the menus here have a cool, small, stylistic touch, where each face button of the gamepad activates a given set of those actions, and is used to select those actions. A for regular attacks, Y for physical, X for item, B to defend and run. This is another small, unique design decision the game makes, and one that continues to help it stand out from the pack, as most battle choices in turn-based games are still being made on glorified spreadsheets. Every character has special moves, and every special move uses the resource Flower Points, and all the party members pull from the same pool of Flower Points. Beyond that, every character functions as an individual, bringing their own strengths to the table. Mario is the classic all-around guy, Mallow the special user, Geno the whatever the hell Geno is, Bowser the tank, and finally Peach as the OP healer.